Okay, can you hear me? Nod your head if you can hear me. Okay, good. We are a pretty small group today, though I think more people might be joining us as we go on. I think things are kind of returning to some simulacrum of normalcy in the world, and as that happens, people are drifting back to their other daily tasks. But still, in fact, it's kind of like a group of 10 or so is what I initially envisioned for the seminar. So we're actually kind of going down to a true seminar intimacy, which is good. We only have today and next Tuesday. There are only 2 sessions left. As you'll recall, originally the idea was to use the final session for simply recapitulation, summary, and let's say concluding reflections on general themes from the critique of the power of judgment. And that is still what I would like to do mostly next week. Spend the bulk of the time in the kind of vein of conclusion, but I'm not going to be able to cover all of the material from the methodology of that we read for today, which means that today I don't know what our speaker Jonathan Egid is going to be covering. I'm only going to be able to cover today the sections 79 through 83, roughly, focusing primarily on the discussion of what you might call generation theory and its relationship to the various broader problems of theories of cause and metaphysical questions. And I think I would like to try to postpone until next week most of my discussion. Jonathan is of course free to range over the whole methodology, but I'd like to postpone most of my discussion of all of the later material concerning happiness, culture, freedom, God, physico-theology, etc., etc. The kind of real final, let's say, jouissance that Kant wraps up the critical project with, where he's asking these really big questions. I'm going to skip most of that in my discussion today. Let me go ahead and pull up my PowerPoint, hit share. You're going to see my whole shameful desktop for a moment. Try not to look. Okay. Now we have my, okay, here we go. So the rough schedule today, we've already done the administrative questions, I suppose. I would like to spend 15 minutes or so in the first part revisiting some of the material that we didn't manage to conclude last week. Then we're going to turn things over to Jonathan Egid. Jonathan, are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, good, excellent, excellent. Yeah, so we're looking forward to that. And then there will be 15 minutes or so for a discussion of Jonathan's presentation. Then we're going to circle back and I'm going to revisit questions from the methodology. Then there will be general discussion. So it's pretty much the same format as last week and as a number of the preceding weeks by now. And I'll just emphasize once again that I invite discussion and interruption at all stages. And indeed today we are counting on input from seminar participants to fill up the time. All right, so you'll recall, I think I need to move on. I hope there are no other administrative questions. Maybe we can circle back around to them at the end today. You'll recall last time we kind of concluded in section 72 with this lovely kind of symmetrical chart-like display of the various possible systems for the explanation of nature, where we have lifeless matter or Epicureanism, lifeless God, well, accidentality or Epicureanism, lifeless God or fatality or Spinozism, living matter or hylozoism, and living God or theism. And we were not able to exhaustively discuss all four of these possibilities. So I wanted briefly to revisit what I called his refutations of these four systems for the explanation of nature. And these are not refutations in the kind of rigorous sense that we sometimes see in Kant's critical works of a kind of they're not transcendental deductions, for example. They are simply more in the vein of informal objections to the basic premises of these different approaches. So I think we already got some kind of feeling for the grounds of his various refutations. And again, recall that the idealism of the first two, that is the attribution of idealism to Epicureanism and Spinozism, it's a peculiar use of idealism. It's a peculiar use of idealism even within the context of Kant's critical project, but it means simply for Kant in this context the view that ends are ultimately something that is imagined. I don't like the word imagined, just like I don't like the phrase as if when we're talking about Kant. The attribution of idealism in this context is the view that ends in nature are not something that really inhere in the in nature itself, or in the ground of nature in the case of theism. And we'll talk about the notion of ground, I hope, in a moment. But it's at least somewhat curious to me to use this phrase for Epicureanism and Spinozism indifferently. As we discussed last time, it might be more correct to say that Epicurus and Spinoza, both in various ways, attribute to others the mistaken idealist view that there are natural ends, rather than Epicureanism and Spinozism themselves upholding the idea of natural ends, right? And so, again, he thinks that both of these are faulty in the case of of Epicureanism, the problem is that it can't even determine the causes of generation in accordance with laws of motion, hence of their mechanism, and nothing is explained, not even the illusion in our teleological judgments, and hence the putative idealism in them is not demonstrated at all. He seems to perhaps have a bit more sympathy for Spinozism, which again, he assimilates to fatalism, and also describes in terms of the two possible opposite pairs of living, lifeless, God and matter. He describes Spinozist fatalism as lifeless God. Now, one comment I wanted to make last week, but didn't have time to make, was when Kant says that Spinozism is the doctrine of the lifeless God. That is, I think, suitably ambiguous phrasing that we might think Kant is intentionally using to kind of get at an ambiguity in Spinoza himself. That is to say, for Spinoza, arguably, God is not eliminated from the system, but rather God has life sucked out of him. If we understand life as acting or willing, then what Spinoza wants to do is to say that God, famously is equivalent to nature. That is, again, on one common reading, on one powerful reading of Spinoza, not to eliminate God, but rather to eliminate, again, in Kant's usage, to eliminate God as a living, acting, willing creator. So I think those are fairly clear, and in the interest of time, and I'm sorry I'm not reading and dwelling on these passages in detail, but at least you can see the slides. You can go back over the slides in the YouTube version of this, and you can isolate the passages. Sorry, I can't see. Yeah, okay, so I do have the marginal pagination and the Geyer pages listed. So again, you can flag these passages as significant and go back over them, even if we're not spending a great deal of time reading them. So hylozoism, I think we discussed this passage in the most detail last week, and I suggested that, again, hylozoism would be the view that matter itself has the property of life, and this is something that is defended by various people in various ways. Famously, Locke says that he's not certain whether matter has the power to, whether there could be such a thing as thinking matter, where thinking is obviously kind of a further kind of possibility supervenient on living. The possibility of matter being capable of life is something that's very widespread, that Kant doesn't have to cite an individual predecessor as a defender of the view. But what's significant here, and I just want to kind of recapitulate this from last week, what's significant here is that Kant dismisses this view readily simply by saying it's a contradiction in terms, because inertia constitutes the essential characteristic of matter, right? That is to say, no possibility for action, by definition, lifeless, right? And again, this is a curious move to make. It's a separation of two concepts that, obviously is important to the project of Cartesian physics, but is not necessarily, obviously, something that every thinker would suppose. And in important respects, for example, Leibniz doesn't think that matter is by definition inert. But in any case, Kant easily dismisses, perhaps too easily or facilely dismisses hylozoism on the grounds that it's a contradiction in terms. Against theism, I think this is perhaps the most interesting of all four, if what we're focusing on is the final sections of the Critique of the Power of Judgment, where Kant wants to understand to which domain of inquiry the study of teleology is going to belong. We start to get this in section 83, and whether, in particular, it's a branch of theology. Theism for Kant, I think I will read this one in its entirety, though I only have 2 minutes. In order to be justified in placing the ground of the unity of purpose in matter beyond nature, that is to say, placing the unity of purpose beyond nature, the unity of purpose that it is in matter, to place that unity of purpose beyond nature in any determinate way, the impossibility of placing this in matter through its mere mechanism would first have to be demonstrated in a way sufficient for the determining power of judgment. And of course, we see this over and over and over again. That's something that, that the determining power of judgment is not capable of doing. In effect, we can kind of see mechanism at work in nature as far as we are able or willing to penetrate. You keep prying and nature keeps yielding up ever more fine-grained mechanical operations. And so for that reason, it doesn't mean for Kant, as it in a certain respect had meant for Leibniz, it doesn't mean for Kant that everything is mechanical. For Leibniz, it's a special kind of mechanical. It doesn't mean for Kant that everything is mechanical. It just means that you're never going to be able to demonstrate in a way sufficient for the determining power of judgment that everything is mechanical. You're just going to be able to discern ever more mechanism. So given that, you don't have the grounds, the justification for placing the ground of the unity of purpose in that is in material things beyond nature. That is to say, in God. If you want a kind of simplistic analogy to more recent debates, you don't have the ground as some quote unquote creation scientists think they do, to look at the flagellum on a species of microorganism and to say that we have here a case of irreducible complexity that is such that we can only attribute the ground for it to something that is beyond nature, right? Kant is not refuting the theory of intelligent design here, but he is anticipating, simply because it doesn't exist as one in a range of options for Kant in the way that it does in the post-Darwinian context. So he's not refuting the doctrine of intelligent design, but he is setting himself up in a way that we can kind of retrospectively say that Kant is no intelligent design theorist, right? He would never say, nope, that flagellum settles it. I'm going to have to make a leap from the flagella to a supersensible ground of the mechanisms in nature. And so I'm going to have to stop there in order to turn things over to Jonathan. But I just wanted to flag this final, so to speak, refutation in section 73, because later on today, and Jonathan might cover some of this, but later on today, I'd also like to talk more about questions of, broadly speaking, design, the unity of morphology that Kant perceives in what will soon come to be called, with figures like Georges Cuvier, comparative anatomy, and the implications of this, as Kant understands it, for thinking about teleology and purposiveness. So I'm just kind of signaling that that this is going to be important again soon enough, if not in Jonathan's talk, then certainly in my own. So let me stop sharing my own screen and pin Jonathan so I can see him. And let me say thanks for volunteering to be what is probably our final presenter, given that we're not doing new material next week. And Jonathan is someone I've never met in person, but we've corresponded, or maybe we have met. I know we've corresponded.
I don't think so.
I know we've corresponded quite a bit, and Jonathan is, among other things, interested in Zera Yaqub, a purported, perhaps real, perhaps not, 17th century Ethiopian philosopher. And we are collectively, not just Jonathan and me, but other people as well, trying to get to the bottom of the Zera Yaqub mystery. So that's really cool. And I don't know your other full range of interests, Jonathan, but we know you're interested in Kant's third critique as well. So thanks.
Indeed, yeah. Thanks, Justin. Yeah, so I've spent I studied philosophy for undergrad and postgrad studies, and spent a lot of time on Kant, mostly on the first critique, Metaphysics of Time, Mendelssohn and Lambert's objections to the idea of the ideality of time. His graduate work, I sort of used Kant to try and argue for some slightly weird positions in contemporary analytic philosophy of mind. Sort of tried to use Kant to something like what Putnam said in the 70s was conceptual relativism, to sort of argue against some of Davidson's stuff in the very idea of a conceptual scheme. But the third critique was something I had just about no idea of sort of what to make heads or tails of. But I was very interested in one of Kant's essays, the idea for a universal history with a cosmopolitan intent. And the more you start to look into just about everything he talks about in there, the more you realize that you need to go to exactly here in the critique of judgment, because it's mechanism and teleology, it's the system of nature as a whole, it's arguments about God and morality, all of that sort of stuff. So I think probably what I'll do now is I'll sort of do a bit of an overview about most things that go in there. I think the section can sort of be this can be split up into three sections. We've got sort of sections 79 to 81 or 82, which are sort of exploring the tension between mechanism and teleology, some of the sort of fallout from the antinomy that we had spoke about last time. So I won't focus on that too much, both because the antinomy was explained really nicely by Chris in the last presentation, but also because Kant applies some of these ideas quite a lot to contemporary debates in biology that I know just about nothing about. So what I'll probably do is I'll focus a little bit more on the middle sections where he's talking about the system of nature as a whole, and how that's supposed to relate to God and morality. But sort of considered as a whole, it's an interesting section because we go from the formation of embryos right up to humanity as the final end of nature in general, and what the ultimate aim of this might be in a system of nature. So, and he does this all fairly quickly. So I'm going to highlight some things I found strange, maybe make some parallels with the history essay and how some of his ideas might have developed between that earlier essay, which I think 1784, and this is 95, isn't it? Yeah, 10 or so years. So the problem that we've sort of left off with from the previous sections is the antinomy, how it's possible to reconcile the need for a mechanical explanation of organized, I can't remember the word, organized beings, not organisms, and the idea that we need to carry on with these mechanical explanations, even though we know we can't explain them or understand them but by appeals to purposes. And the basic answer that he gives to this is given in the heading of section 80, which is that we need to subordinate teleology, subordinate mechanism to teleology. I basically understand this subordination to be something like the idea that you need to go to the teleology first, like as in you need to use this as a ground before you're going to go off and do any of your mechanical sciences. It's a precondition to being able to start any of this mechanical work. Obviously, he's mentioned in around the same sort of place that he introduces the antinomy, this idea of an intuitive intellect. And if we were intuitive intellects, we wouldn't need teleology to get all of our inquiries off the ground. But given that we're not intuitive intellects, we need to employ both, right? We need to have all of them. We might sort of, I'll suggest this and then someone can tell me why it's wrong, but we might sort of adapt the famous dictum from the start, from the first critique, that concepts without intuitions are blind, intuitions without concepts are, oh no, it's empty and then blind, it's the other way around. But we might sort of rework that into mechanism without teleology is empty and teleology without mechanism is blind. Again, I'm not sure which one's supposed to be empty and which one blind, but the idea that if you have mechanism with no teleology, you're not really going to be able to get started. Your theory is going to be empty in some way. But if you only have a teleology, if you only have the idea of purpose without any of the mechanical work, without any of the science, you have an idea of a purpose, but nowhere. Nothing to pad that idea out. Good. So in sections 80 and 81, he's going to sort of introduce the problems of epigenesis and preformation, as well as some of the stuff about species origins. I'll leave all of that to Justin, but I'll mention for now that they're both of the solutions that Kant endorses there are in a sense mixed views, in the way that there needs to be this sort of mix I was suggesting earlier of teleological and mechanical explanation. They're mechanical in the sense that they are naturalistic, causal, law-governed accounts of, say, how an embryo forms, but they're teleological in the sense that Kant thinks we can't get any of these counts off the ground if we haven't already assumed living matter, right? And living matter is something that cannot be understood but in teleological terms. And so in 82, and the one after that, he begins to sort of broaden this account out, right? So if we go from the formation of the embryo to, the ultimate purpose of nature on the other end, this is the sort of first point where he's zooming it out. He's starting to think about not just organisms, but items in their environment as well. So he starts with the possibility that the natural environment itself, or rather some parts of the natural environment themselves, are purposive. Now, it might be perfectly legitimate to think that there's a sense in which a river is purposive for a eucalyptus tree, in that it allows it to continue existing. The eucalyptus tree is purposive for the koala, in that it allows it to keep existing. But Kant wants to insist that, you know, we don't need to explain, we can explain these well enough in terms of mechanism. We don't need to appeal to their usefulness to other things in order to understand them. But it might be worth distinguishing an inner and an outer sense of purposiveness. And he is, I think, so inner purposiveness, I don't remember too clearly from the earlier sections, but I think he's mentioned this one already. And in defining outer purposiveness, he's basically wanting to say that, or no, it's external purposiveness maybe. But in any case, he wants to say that that's the idea of one thing in nature serving another one as a means to an end, roughly in the way that the river is for the eucalyptus tree is for the koala. And the idea then is that, you know, the rocks that make up a mountain, sand, shrubs, lichen, whatever else, all of these things can have an outer purposiveness. Yeah, extrinsic and extrinsic. Okay, great. And yeah, so these ones have outer purposiveness instead of inner purposiveness. And from that stage, he'll sort of zoom out once more to consider nature as a whole to be a system of these extrinsic or external purposes. There's a nice quote, I've actually forgotten exactly where this is from. I think this is 82 somewhere. That if one looks at the vegetable kingdom, one could initially be led by the immeasurable fertility by which it spreads itself over practically every terrain, to think of it as a mere product of the mechanism of nature that is displayed in the formations of the mineral kingdom. But a close acquaintance with the indescribably wise organization of the former does not allow us to stop with this thought, but rather leads us to the question, why do these creatures exist? If one answers for the animal kingdom, which is nourished by it so that it's able to spread itself over the earth in so many genera, then the question arises again, why do these herbivorous animals exist? Now, whenever you're setting up a chain like that to say, well, what's all of the other things for, you're inevitably going to say, well, it's all for us. We're here at the top. And there's a really important sense in which for a moment, which we're going to come to in a moment, in which we are the thing that stands at the top of all of this as the final or the ultimate end. But we'll come to that in a moment, because before we sort of start talking about the human, it's worth sort of thinking a little bit more, I think, about the idea of nature as a whole being purposive. Where have these notes got to? Okay, so here we've got a consideration of not just particular items of the environment like rocks or shrubs or whatever. We're considering the environment in general. So it seems difficult to argue that nature as an entire system is purposive for us, perhaps, if this environment came to be completely chaotically and wildly. So there's another nice quote here. Again, I'm sorry, I haven't jotted down exactly where this one is, but maybe if there's a PDF, we can search it. It starts with the land and the sea. So the land and the sea do not merely contain monuments of ancient powerful devastations that have affected them and every creature on and in them. Their entire construction, the strata of the land and the boundaries of the sea, have every appearance of the product of a wild, all-powerful forces of a nature working in a chaotic state. Yeah, great, 259, thanks. And so part of the point here is that he's introducing the first stages of a criticism of physico-teleology and physico-theology. So a lot of the proponents of these things would be pointing to, I don't know, how pleasant the sort of sponginess of the grass is for us to sit on, and wasn't that just designed for our bottoms to be particularly comfortable on, or wasn't some other feature of the natural environment obviously designed in this way? And part of the point here is supposed to be that no matter how amenable some part of nature might be to human flourishing or to our happiness, there are, the environment in general is created by these sort of huge scraping, sort of flooding upheavals that are profoundly indifferent, if not hostile, to our presence here. Now, I don't have too much to say about the physico-theology, apart from that Kant's got a really interesting, long and complicated history with ideas of physico-theology, of physico-teleology as well. Now, he's, I think it's 83 that is the only possible ground, which is one of the essays where, a little bit like he's going to do in the later sections of the methodology, try and distinguish between some different proofs of God and try and talk about the only one which we really can go in for. Now, in 1863, he thinks it's some sort of modal argument about the grounds of possibility of anything existing at all. Later on, as we're going to see here, it's a moral argument which functions very differently. But in both of them, he's got a sort of an objection to, but also a begrudging respect for physico-teleology. I think he talks about in the 1860s and 70s the sort of the fact that you can't help but be inspired by it, or that you'd have to be stupid not to take seriously some of the sort of basics of physico-teleology. Method of physico-teleology and suggests an improved method instead, which has got 6 heuristic rules, which could probably be quite interesting to compare to what's going on in the critique of judgment here. But I'll try and breeze over them in the interest of time. So I guess, suffice to say that here Kant's objection to it is an objection to the idea that we can use natural teleology to provide a proof of God, or to prove the existence of God. And the basic criticism, at least how I teach a version of this criticism to some of my students who are doing the A-levels in philosophy in England, who need to learn about teleological arguments, is that a teleological argument, at least of the sort of naive kind that Kant's categorizing there, it can give you an intelligent designer, it can give you an architect, it can give you something like that, but it's not going to give you all of the attributes that you want of a traditional omnipresent, omnibenevolent Judeo-Christian God. For that, you're going to need a much bigger and more ambitious argument, which is the one that Kant's going to sort of go on to provide now. So he contrasts this sort of inadequate physico-teleology, which, even if it works, isn't going to give us God, with moral teleology, and in particular with these ideas of man as a final purpose of nature that we were alluding to earlier when we were talking about the, what are plants for, what are herbivores for, what are carnivores for. Now, if we're thinking about what the final end could be, and I suppose this is probably a bit where I'm going to talk about some things that Justin won't talk about today, is that when we're thinking about what a final end or an ultimate end could be for us, there seem to be two, what's the best way of putting this? Best way of putting it will be to just read the quote instead. So, now if that which is to be promoted as an end through the human being's connection to nature is to be found within the human being himself, then there must either be either the kind of end that can be satisfied by the beneficence of nature itself, or the aptitude and skill for all sorts of ends for which you can use nature. So if man is going to be the ultimate end of nature, then what this can involve is either their happiness themselves, what nature can provide for you. If you happen to want ice cream and nature provides with ice cream, you can be happy in some sense. Thanks for these page numbers. I'm sorry for having missed those off. There's a nice definition of happiness here as the idea of a state to which he would make his instincts adequate under merely empirical conditions, followed by the brackets, which is impossible. I wasn't quite sure with the sentence what the impossible was supposed to refer to, but I take it that Kant's not necessarily saying that happiness is impossible in the sense we understand it, at least. But so the reason that this can't be the ultimate end, this can't be what we're after, is that insofar as we're seeking happiness, we're only a chain in the series of another link in the chain of natural ends, right? We're wanting something in nature, and we're using our bodies to go off and try and get it. And this is insufficient, basically, for what Kant wants to do, which is that to be an ultimate end, you have to, in some sense, have risen above nature, right? And I actually can't remember exactly. This is maybe a little bit bad. The final end, ultimate end distinction. So one of them is about being sort of the highest thing in nature, and the other one's being the thing which is above nature in general. I think I'm not going to guess. Someone can pop that in the chat maybe. But the thing which does raise us above and which allows us to be the second, the outside of nature one, is us considered as our noumenal selves, as choosing morally free agents. And that's because we can, we can choose our own purposes. We can sort of be legislators as well as this was a person anyway. So it can't be our happiness which is going to justify all of this. So what else could it be? Kant suggested it could be culture. So this was the aptitude and skill for all sorts of ends for which you can use nature, right? So culture is essentially this thing which is supposed to be able to bridge our status as an ultimate end, as being noumenal, as being somehow outside of nature, and our existence as a being, at the top of this pile of things which are there in nature. And this is basically the idea that, we it's in order to prepare ourselves for this final end of for preparing ourselves, there needs to be this sort of again, I'll read the quote instead. Oh no, that's not the right quote. So it is the aptitude for setting himself ends at all and independent from nature in his determination of ends, using nature as means appropriate to the maxims of his free ends in general, as that which nature can accomplish with a view to the final end that lies outside of it, and which can therefore be regarded as its ultimate end. Again, that helps me out with the muddle there. Exactly, and it's the production of this aptitude, right? It's our becoming apt for embracing this final end of moving towards it some way, is what we call culture. Kant's going to go on to distinguish two kinds of culture. We have a culture of skill and a culture of will. It's the latter of these that he's going to be focusing on. The culture of skill is a kind of self-disciplining in some way. It's a kind of putting to the side those heteronymous, the despotism of desires, all of these things which are coming from outside of us and making us want to do different things. It's only when we're fully autonomously choosing as us ourselves that we're doing this sort of disciplined work. Right, so there's a nice quote here which I actually do have a page number for, which is that at 83 we've got Kant's point that culture is the ultimate purpose of nature because it prepares man for what he must do in order to be the final purpose of nature. So in the last couple of minutes, I guess that instead of turning to the last bits on God, I'll draw the parallel with some of the stuff that goes on in the universal history. So if anyone doesn't know that essay, Kant's basically sketching a sort of speculative account of human history, leading towards via a sort of teleological process in which the human organism, the human species is developing. Okay, great, thanks. That the human being is developing its capacities. The capacity which is characteristic of the human being is, unsurprisingly for Kant, reason. So when he's developing this capacity of reason intergenerationally, and Kant insists that the unit of history has to be the species, right? It can't be a particular civilization, a nation, or a culture. It has to be the human organism taken as a totality in space and time. And essentially, so history is to be understood as the purposive development of these faculties by the means of this wonderful mechanism that he calls unsocial sociability. The fact that we really don't like other people and we really just want to be, in Kant's view at least, staying at home and studying philosophy. But unfortunately, our needs and the fact that we can, produce much better books if we do go and speak to people, and if there can be other people's books that we can read, and all of this stuff forces us into society with other people. And it's this sort of antagonism which is sort of moving this process forwards. It is what ensures that there's not this sort of historical stagnation. I've said more than I planned to there. So the first parallel with what's going on here is that history for Kant has to be considered as purposive. And it has to be considered as purposive because Kant just thinks the data is too messy, it's too chaotic. And the reason that I sort of added a couple of quotes that mentioning this sort of chaos that Kant was talking about earlier is that I think he really is, this is sort of one of the spectres that hangs over a lot of different problems throughout the critical philosophy, right from the sort of, I think in maybe the first or second week we were talking about, you know, empirical chaos or something like that. And I actually don't know whether that was referring to exactly what I have in mind by empirical chaos, but this idea that, you know, before the forms of intuition and experience and the understanding are applied to the world, it's just this crazy, buzzing manifold out there, this completely chaotic thing. And that in some form, what's happening in a lot of different places in the critiques is Kant sort of trying to instill some kind of order on this wild chaos that cannot be allowed to be. And I'll talk about why exactly that's supposed to be one in a second. So yeah, this is a quote from the first bit of that where he's talking about this chaotic data of history. So he says that since the philosopher cannot presuppose any individual purpose amongst men in their great drama, there is no other expedient for him except to try and see if he can discover a natural purpose in this idiotic course of things human. In keeping with this purpose, it might be possible to have a history with a definite natural plan for creatures who have no plan of their own. And he does this after contrasting the difficulties of writing a human history with a history of beavers or of bees. There's not much of a problem there because you don't have to reconcile their action considered as appearance and their actions considered as free choice. That's the sort of difficulty here. And he points basically to the case of the fact that there's a sort of regularity. So he talks about there doesn't seem to be anything which is more spontaneous, freely chosen than whether we get married or not. And yet when you look at the marriage tables of large countries, you see that there are these huge regularities, births, deaths, all of this sort of stuff. They display a regularity that even though people haven't been choosing when to die or, you know, get married, according to this plan, nevertheless, they do follow it. And as soon as we use this idea to justify projecting some sort of teleological principle onto history in order to understand it, we're going to be faced with the problem that's raised in the antinomy, a sort of tension between mechanism and teleology, in that history, as he defines it, is the study of the totality of human actions considered as appearances, right? So considered according to what the first critique tells us has to be understood only mechanically. And it's not like he came up with this idea before he'd, you know, properly come up with the critique. This is published in 84, which is exactly in the middle of the A and the B editions of the first critique. So he's aware of this problem. And, you know, he notes the concern really, right at the end of the essay, actually. He says, it's strange and apparently silly to wish to write a history in accordance with an idea of how the course of the world must be if it's to lead to certain rational ends. It seems that with such an idea, only a romance could be written. And this is something that, you know, I think most practicing historians tend to think about teleology in history at the moment, that you can't do, you know, projecting something at the end is going to lead you to write maybe a nice story that this was always going to happen, but it's not good history to do. So yeah, so the basic idea here is that even if we are too blind, and these are all from the ninth thesis of the essay, even if we're too blind to see the secret mechanism of its workings, this idea may still serve as a guiding thread for presenting as a system, at least in broad outlines, what would otherwise be a planless conglomerate of human actions. So it's this idea again, if we want to get any kind of scientific grip on the topic, be it history, be it biology, be it theology, we're going to need to, you know, subordinate mechanism to theology. Okay, so this idea that we've got to treat history as proposed, or some subject as proposive for our cognitive faculties, is familiar enough. We've come across that. But Kant also gives a second argument here, which is the argument that's made in the rest of the methodology from morality. So it gets hinted at in the first thesis, and this is the first thesis, which is that if we give up this fundamental principle that all natural capacities of a creature are destined to evolve completely to their natural end, that's his first premise of the argument, then we no longer have a lawful but an aimless course of nature, and blind chance takes the place of the guiding thread of reason, right? That's the spectre of empirical chaos again. But it's also the problem that without such a principle, history seems a really tough place to be. It seems like history is irredeemable. He talks about, well, there was the bit about it sort of seeming like idiotic chance earlier. There's another quote about, where he sounds very angry with history and talks about it being this unjustifiable thing. Whereas if we look back at it and we don't have this teleological principle, we're just going to think that it's all awful. Now, that might be the right thing to think. Why has Kant got a problem with us looking back at history and thinking it's all awful? And it's because he thinks that we need to have, if we don't have some kind of justification of history, if we don't have, so the name of the essay is The Idea for a Universal History with a Cosmopolitan Intent, or a Cosmopolitan Purpose sometimes. I don't know what the variously translated German word is there. So Kant thinks that we need a kind of theodicy of history, or a historiodicey, or something like that, because if we don't have some sort of justification, and if there's no way of redeeming history, essentially, my interpretation of this is, at least, is that we'll be hopeless, right? The idea is that if there's no sort of plan for understanding things going forward, there's going to be a lack of hope. And if there is no hope, then there is no way that humanity will develop their faculties in this way so as to attain this sort of this final end. I think I've missed a little bit out there, but essentially the first idea is that we've got, similar to biology, the idea that history needs to be purposive for our cognitive faculties, and the second idea that there seems to need to be a kind of moral justification for what's going on here that teleology has to be a part of. And it's largely, it almost seems pragmatic in the sense that by treating nature teleologically, by treating it as if there were a purpose to history, we can then bring that purpose about. Yeah, and so we've got another quote here right from the end, which is a philosophical attempt to work out a universal history according to a natural plan directed to achieving the civic union of the human race must be regarded as possible and indeed as contributing to the end of nature. So it's actually that working out the philosophy of it is going to allow us to get there. The essay also shows just why culture is such an important thing for Kant. Culture is what we sort of develop by our moral education of successive generations. It's the only way in which there can be any history at all, in a sense. If it were just that, every generation had to start anew, there wouldn't be such a thing. We wouldn't be able to develop our capacity of reason in the way that there being a history sort of demands. So I'll try and get back to the text very quickly, although it's almost o'clock. But it's interesting to think about maybe what he would hold on to from this earlier essay, and what he'd have to reject. He'd certainly have to be a lot more. He'd have to be a lot more careful about his phrasing, and you really notice in the Critique of Judgment that the phrasing about when we can employ teleology is a lot more tentative. I think a couple of weeks ago, one of the presenters mentioned the subjunctive quite a lot, and it really is, once you sort of see that, it's everywhere in the text. But it does, the important thing is that it seems to me that the fundamental idea of the sort of triad between the understanding, teleology, and mechanism, and this sort of moral triad of chaos, hope, and morality sort of seem largely the same in the Critique of Judgment as they did back then. Shall I stop now and pass back to you, Justin? Yeah, I think that's. Okay. There were some things about demonology I wanted to ask, but I'll leave that for now.
You can maybe work them in somehow later on in discussion. But first of all, thank you very much. So virtual applause. That's really very excellent and thorough, and gives us a lot to work with in our developing conversation. We have plenty of time for discussion if someone else has something they want to jump off from in what you said. I'll let anyone else go first. If not, I have comments. Again, feel free to start in an initial stage with a chat comment, or just turn your mic on and start talking. Either way is fine. I wanted to say just, oh yeah. First of all, Isaiah asked a question and Catherine jumped in. By the way, I don't think I've introduced properly Catherine Wilson, who joined us just last week, is a late arriver to our seminar and is quarantined in Berlin. Some of you, many of you may know Catherine's work on Kant and on Epicureanism and on Leibniz and on many other things. And so I hope we'll hear some input from her later on today. And in fact, we've already had some input from Catherine, because she answered Isaiah's question about monogenesis. I was going to start to answer it in somewhat the same key, but maybe because Sarah says she had some interest in Isaiah's question, maybe I'll just ask the lot of you, Isaiah, Catherine, Jonathan, whether you have further input on this, and if not, I have something to say.
I don't know anything about monogenesis.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, so yeah, you probably saw my quick comment. I really think that's it. The monogenesis is so that there's one species, and the destiny of humanity is to spread all over the whole world. And because of these Keime and Anlagen, there are these propensities that enable people to live at the North Pole, or live in the jungle or the desert or wherever. So that's a hint that the destiny of the species is to be all over the place. And then ideally, well, we should hope and we should look for signs that a cosmopolitan federation will eventually develop when people get tired of killing each other. Even though, as Jonathan was saying, the empiricist says, look, it's all just a disaster. Bale says the history is just the charnel house, like Hegel. No point to it, no purpose to it. It's just one thing after another. So Kant in these sections keeps kind of contrasting what the empiricist says that depresses us, that is pessimistic, but why he thinks you have to get past that and how you can get past that. That's my interpretation.
In a way, Kant is really onto something. I mean, obviously there's a significant difference between us and, say, mountain gorillas or orangutans in terms of our ability to occupy a variety of habitats. And if there's a coming massive war or environmental catastrophe or something like that, we probably will have a better chance of surviving than orangutans. But that made me think also back to the passages earlier in the critique where Kant says some seemingly pretty disparaging things about the Laplanders. And you'll notice the Laplanders come back again in Kant's discussion of Linnaeus. Kant is reading Linnaeus's notes on Lapland for these references. Earlier in the critique, we saw Kant saying that, you know, even if it's true that that the rocks are there for the moss to grow on, and the moss is there for the reindeer to eat, and the reindeer are there for the Laplanders to herd, still it's pretty hard to understand why the Laplanders should exist at all if we take the Laplanders in abstraction from the potential of a future cosmopolitan global confederacy. That's the part that's implied there, that doesn't get stated explicitly at that point in the critique. We also get somewhere close by Kant saying something to the effect that it's difficult to understand why the South Sea Islanders should exist at all if they're just going to reproduce generation after generation like sheep with no, in effect, with no history, right? And in order to have history, you have to have some kind of development towards the greater culture in the dual sense that Jonathan spelled out. And so these are in part my answers to the question concerning monogenesis, and kind of helping to supplement Catherine's answer to kind of this question, like why all of this human diversity anyway? And, you know, the kind of subsidiary question is, why are there Laplanders? Why are there South Sea Islanders? And I think that is something that can help us belatedly to understand passages we looked at much earlier. Now, I wanted to say something briefly. I have a lot of different comments on your discussion, Jonathan. I've never paid very close attention to the universal history, so it's nice to hear about it from someone who's really worked on it. I do have a side gig as a social historian of the beaver. I'm very interested in the history of representations of the beaver, and I'm pretty sure the passage that you cite from the universal history where he talks about beavers is this wonderful lithograph that I can show you. I think it's from 1744. Charlevoix, who is a French traveler in New France in Canada, and it's a very kind of influential representation because it shows beavers working to build in what is in effect a city, like a kind of utopian commune type space that is an idealized version of the Beaver Dam. It's kind of a touchstone for subsequent mid to late 18th century reflections on just how, on the limits of our kind of exceptionalist understanding of human beings. And of course, Kant is kicking back against these arguments against human exceptionalism and denying that there's something of interest going on there, and maybe deflating reports of the impressiveness of these beaver cities. But that made me think again of this telling passage that you quoted, Jonathan, about Linnaeus, because in effect what Linnaeus is saying in this passage, if I recall correctly, and I don't have it pulled up right now, is that, you know, what are the herbivores there for? Well, to keep the plants from just growing and growing without end. What are the carnivores are there for? To keep the herbivores from eating all the plants. Then Linnaeus also adds, what are the humans there for? Well, they're there to hunt the carnivores and to keep them from eating all the herbivores, right? So Linnaeus, and this seems to be of a pair with Linnaeus's, I mean, I admit Linnaeus is poker-faced. He doesn't really explain why he's doing what he's doing. But this kind of resolutely ecological understanding of, ecological avant la lettre, understanding of what human beings are for, is something that's of a pair for Linnaeus with his insertion of homo among the anthropomorpha, and this kind of general effect of the Linnaean system of turning the project of natural classification back upon the human being, whereas in general terms, prior to Linnaeus, it was always the human being looking out upon nature and classifying everything in it, but not being himself subject to such classification. And so Kant then is, in effect, kicking back against, just like he's kicking back against representations of beavers as exemplars of industry and hard work and therefore moral virtue, he's also kicking back against this line of approach that he seems to see in Linnaeus of thinking about the ecological niche that human beings occupy as relevant to answering the real question, what is a human being for, right? Does that make sense? Because so again, if that's like, if that's all a human being were for, then we could be satisfied with the existence of Laplanders as such, right? Where without having to go beyond that to the, the cosmopolitan confederacy of enlightenment and so on, right? So that's just kind of, again, trying to put together different parts of the critique and of Kant's project as a whole.
But so is the idea partially then that he doesn't have any disagreement with what Linnaeus is saying insofar as it's sort of a description of empirical phenomena, but it's just not a good answer to the question, what are humans for?
Right, exactly.
Way, you can happily accede that Newton's laws of motion are completely deterministic. You can't do anything about the apply absolutely entirely, but that's not a very good answer to the question about something like that.
Right, exactly.
John Zimito has this nice phrase, policing the animal-human boundary, and Kant is always doing that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's like, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because Kant in so many ways bumps up against that boundary himself, in also thinking about evolution, which we can talk about a bit later on today, but also, thinking about ecology and thinking about, on the one hand, being very interested in such things as hydrography, and thinking about the kind of natural parameters of human life, but on the other hand, constantly trying to reassert the ultimate irrelevance of these parameters for answering the question, quid sit homo, right? Yeah. Any other comments or questions for Jonathan? Again, I've still got more, but I just want to...
Actually,
yes, I had one about this subordination of mechanism to teleology. I think it's 422. And I think you were reading that, Jonathan, in a very methodological way. But he says something that sounds kind of stronger, that the mechanism of nature is the instrument of a cause that acts intentionally. And that sounds almost like a kind of Leibnizian picture where this teleological force is just using mechanism to get its work done. And I wondered if you thought there was also that quite realistic reading of it.
Sorry, where this was again, this was 422.
422.
422. Yeah, not by the mechanism.
Because it was sort of fit with the theory of history as well.
Yeah, because in the history it really is, you know, there's the cunning of history. It's actually doing the work itself.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought about this way of reading it at all, just because I think probably because I thought in advance that that's not what he was supposed to have been saying.
Yes.
You know, insofar as making the parallels that I was trying to make with the historical essay, I think that's definitely a way of extending it.
No, I think Kant is a little weirder, a little less critical than we sometimes take him to be.
Yeah, as if it were the tool of an intention. Yeah, no, because that really does sound like the bits in the essay where he's talking about the hand of providence and all of this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I don't have anything clever to say about it. Sorry, but
it's an interesting dynamic here where Catherine has kind of come along to give us a more kind of deflating take on some of these passages, where we spent some of our early weeks trying to be like, okay, let's assume at the outset that that he's not confused and see what we can make of this. Jonathan, did you want to say something more?
No. Sorry, I'm just reading the quote over again.
I think I started to hear Ognian's voice at some point.
I just wanted to add a remark about this divide between humans and nature.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a huge topic, but I just want to emphasize something about history, like both in that treatise on the cosmopolitan history,
mm-hmm.
and in this later treatise on perpetual peace.
Mm-hmm.
And in our reading for today, Kant makes, and what Jonathan was talking about, Kant makes a special point about humans in the end being beings that live in nature, that are natural. And in a way, he tries to make the point that nature itself, as nature, is purposive to human history.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so, if you look at perpetual peace, he would say that, like as Jonathan said, or Catherine in the cosmopolitan history, he would say providence, whereas in perpetual peace, which is later than the third critique, he would say that nature itself, like the great artist nature, that's the expression, is the guarantee for perpetual peace, which is the ultimate human goal.
Yeah.
Because here, if we go to the Laplanders and those people in Africa and so on, whom he alludes to, he's trying to, in a way, he's saying that the harsh conditions in which they live actually stimulate them to develop their reason and their capacity to overcome nature. So in a way, he's looking at ways that the counter-purposiveness of nature is actually purposeful to the development of human history.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's a huge topic that I'm just like pointing my finger to, and I don't want to like delve into it, but yeah.
No, absolutely. It's sort of there being an antagonism which is the driving force of this, and there being an antagonism which is grounded in some way in something to do with the kind of beings that we are.
I think he's interested in showing how nature facilitates that process. So in a way, he's policing the divide between humans and nature, but he's also trying to kind of not police it too much, I guess.
Yeah. Well, that's the cunning of nature, right? That it's able to sort of, plant this little seed in humans right at the start that is going to lead them to develop it via this, And also, I suppose it's cunning in that it's the same thing which causes the wars and anger and some of the sort of he talks about that somewhere in here as well, actually, about the fact that humans, I can't find the exact quote, that
Yeah, it's in
We find it
yeah,
hard to be happy because, you know, we bring it on ourselves, sort of thing.
Yeah, that's paragraph 83.
Not just what nature's like.
Yeah, there's almost something. One is tempted to use the term theodicy in, or at least theodicy-like, in this idea that on the one hand, nature with its tsunamis and whirlpools and earthquakes and so on is indifferent to us, as if we were not creatures with ends, and sweeps us up just as indifferently as it sweeps up dust. But that counterpurposiveness itself is a force that's relevant to understanding the coming to consciousness of our life as beings with ends. That is, for Kant, history, right? So, I mean, I'm thinking of these passages in Leibniz's Theodicy in particular, where he's trying to kind of answer the question why it's so hard to extract valuable minerals from the earth. And the language is somewhat similar in this, the idea of the earth's resistance as itself source of value, right?
Oh, so sorry. The difficulty of extracting minerals is an analogy there, not a...
Yeah. I'm thinking of it.
Okay.
I don't think Kant is. It's just that the two passages resonate with one another in a way that tempts me to speak of these passages in Kant in terms of theodicy. Whitney, did you want to jump in and say something? I saw your video go on.
Sorry, no.
Oh, no, don't be sorry. No. It's just you were dark for a while and then you appeared, and I thought.
No, that was just because I was eating my lunch. I didn't want to look that.
Okay. Let's see. I had a few other comments for Jonathan. I don't want to take up too much time with it. I really was intrigued by this idea of the analogy with intuition and concepts being variously empty and blind. It's certainly interesting to think about. I would think that the order, if we were to extend the analogy, and this is just my intuition, so to speak, is that it would have to be mechanism without teleology is blind, and teleology without mechanism is empty, right? Blind because, if it doesn't know where it's going, right?
You don't know which bits of nature you need to understand mechanically unless you've got the teleology. Yeah.
And it certainly is, let's say, an appropriation from another part of Kant's critical project that seems justified. All right. Any other? So thanks again very much for that. I wanted to say, maybe I can say it a little bit later, talk of culture. If I don't have time to get to it by the end of today, maybe it's worth talking about now. It's been some years since I've thought about this, but I think I already invoked earlier this book by Adam Cooper called Culture, the History of Culture, A History of the Idea, or something that I strongly recommend. And the Cooper, to some extent, that's Kuper, gives the standard or familiar account that is worth learning if you don't know it already, of the idea that culture becomes a value in the specifically German context in the late 18th century, and that it is associated in particular with the name of Herder, and that it would come to be associated with reactions against Enlightenment value of civilization. And that's simplifying or schematizing a great deal, but I wanted to emphasize that it's by Adam Cooper. He's actually an anthropologist, but something of an intellectual historian, and it's just called Culture, with some sort of subtitle. But I mean, numerous works on the Enlightenment, on German Romanticism. You know, it's kind of this, the canned versions of what I'm giving you here, which is also a canned version, are kind of everywhere. But the reason why I brought this up is because it's, you know, it's interesting that Kant is dwelling on this, and I wanted to highlight again that this is ultimately a metaphor that is drawn from the natural world. In particular, you know, when, I mean, in English, we still have yogurt with bacteria culture in it, though for the most part in English, unlike French and I suppose German too, well, certainly in French, I'm comfortable with French, the term as standing alone typically means, you know, what you do to raise anything up in a natural sense, like bacteria or grain or, you know, fish or the other sorts of culture without prefix, right? And so it's interesting and just worth reflecting on in a kind of intellectual history sort of way, the idea that Kant is taking a term that that still resonates in terms of connotation with farming and related endeavors, to nonetheless remove the human being and ultimate human ends from the sequence of what can be described as outer ends of things like irrigation and stuff like that. So I just wanted to flag that, and maybe we can get back to it a bit later. Let me now, in the interest of time, highlight a few passages from the reading for today. And again, don't look at my screen. This is embarrassing. I can't find the little thing that makes it. Oh, there it is. There it is. Okay. So let me just try to emphasize a few of what I take to be the most important passages from not the whole reading. Again, we can come back to the later sections of the appendix on methodology next week, but just sections 79 through 83, I want to walk you through some of the hot spots. So I think Jonathan has, as it turns out, already done a pretty good job with section 79 and the suggestion of a kind of perhaps a subordination of mechanism to teleology. Kant begins section 79, which is the beginning of the appendix, with the question, where does teleology belong? Is it part of the doctrine of nature, or does it rather belong to theology? And one way of thinking about this question, you'll recall a few weeks ago when we were still trying to get a handle on what the concept of teleology is, I suggested that if we look at a text like Aristotle's De Anima, Aristotle's On the Soul, we get a sense of teleology as an inextricable element of what Kant is here calling natural science. That is to say that teleology ultimately psychologizes earth, air, fire, water, planets, the tides, and the clouds, and so on. But that's simply because there is something truly in every corner of the natural world that is similar in its nature to what in a person we call the soul, and it's in virtue of the inherence of that soul or similar that that things in nature are doing what they do. So now in Aristotle then we have an example of someone who would be able to answer this question Kant poses really quickly and say, well, teleology obviously belongs to natural science. And yet for Aristotle also, in a sense, it belongs to theology because, as we discussed, it's a kind of ultimately an approximate realization of what God does fully, that natural things pursue their ends. And so in this respect, Aristotle answers unproblematically or uncomplexedly both to this question that Kant is worrying about, and for which Kant would also no doubt judge Aristotle to be working in a naive vein, right? In view of his the ease with which he would answer these questions. I mean, Kant isn't engaging with Aristotle directly here. It's just that Aristotle offers us an easy way to kind of anchor the question that Kant is getting at. All right, so let's just kind of look at these opening paragraphs of section 79 a bit further. It does not belong to theology. It can't belong to theology as a part of theology, Kant explains, for it has as its object natural productions and their cause. And although it refers to the latter as a ground lying outside of and beyond nature, a divine author, it does not do this for the determining power of judgment, but merely for the reflecting power of judgment in the consideration of nature. So again, I don't mean to force too much Aristotle on you, but I do think it's helpful. Aristotle's idea, you know, in the famous what Jeffrey Lloyd calls the invitation to biology on the parts of animals, where Aristotle is in effect looking at a sea cucumber or a starfish or something and saying, here too there is something of the divine, right? Aristotle's idea is that studying marine biology, studying starfish, is not a wholly different project from studying theology, or as his contemporaries would have wanted, studying astronomy, which is to say the study of the celestial divinities. You can do it with starfish too. Starfish will work for this project. For Kant, by contrast, the relationship between, as it were, the starfish and the divine author is different, even if we recognize the ground of the starfish as lying outside of and beyond nature, first of all, we don't have a concept of that is to say a determinate concept of that ground. We only have it's only within our reflecting power of judgment. This is something we've seen so many times in Kant, in the third critique, the distinction between the determining and the reflecting power of judgment. This, almost starts to sound excessively repetitive. So that's one reason why studying starfish is not studying theology for Kant, in contrast with Aristotle. But another is, I think, that for Kant, even forgetting for now the distinction between the reflecting and the determining, for Kant, the fact that the starfish has a divine author as its ground lying outside of and beyond nature doesn't mean that there's something divine about the starfish, as there is for Aristotle. And therefore, for Aristotle, the study of the starfish is contributory to theology. And the reason it doesn't, I think, is because, again, the relationship between the starfish and God is different in each case. On the one hand, for Aristotle, the relationship is one of, let's say, partial or approximate realization of what God does fully. For Kant, by contrast, the relationship is one of authorship. And so I hope that helps to kind of get at the reasons for Kant's exclusion of teleology from both natural science and theology. If it doesn't help, at least it gives you a hint of how interesting Aristotle is. If nothing else, maybe we'll do Aristotle next. So teleology is not part of theology. Is it part of natural science? Well, no. Just as little does it seem to belong in natural science, teleology that is, which requires determining and not merely reflecting principles in order to provide objective grounds for natural effects. We're seeing the same distinction again between the determining and the reflecting. In fact, nothing is gained for the theory of nature or the mechanical explanation of its phenomena by its efficient causes when they are considered in light of the relation of ends to one another. So again, we've already seen this, but I think it comes out more distilled or clarified in the repetition, to the extent that we are doing natural science, we're investigating mechanism, right? And the minute you stop investigating mechanism, you are doing something else. So there is no way that teleology can be shifted over to natural science, even though it certainly doesn't belong to theology. Now, this might highlight a problem. You'll notice in the passage I began with, which is the first paragraph of section 79, Kant says, just after the part I've underlined here, it must be one or the other, right? But then a bit later, Kant says teleology does not belong to any doctrine at all, but only to critique. So you might see that as an inconsistency. Kant says it must belong to one or the other. A few paragraphs later, he says, it belongs to neither. Right? It belongs only to critique, and indeed to the critique of a particular cognitive faculty, namely that of the power of judgment. I just wanted to interrupt myself for a moment and say that because I'm sharing my full screen, I'm not sure if I can see your chats. Does someone want to send me a chat? Just, okay, I can see them. And that said, don't hesitate to send chats and to interrupt me. Could you say that critique is in some way reflective? Yes. I mean, critique is, this is oversimplifying, but critique is what you do or what it's appropriate to do when you determine that you're thinking about something, or that you're investigating something where you can't come up with any determinate concepts, where the determining power of judgment isn't doing any work for you. I don't want to say that's when you give up and shift to critique, because in some sense Kant thinks critique is better, but yes, indeed, you can say that critique is reflective in that way. Thanks, Sarah. Okay, so again, I don't know if Kant contradicts himself here, or if he in some way takes back what he said, and he anticipated this this imminent taking back. But in any case, it turns out that it's not true, as he said in the first paragraph, that that teleology has to belong to the one or the other. In fact, it belongs to neither. Reflective judgment and critique are not synonymous. And just again, I don't want to repeat myself, but critique is what you do when reflective judgment is the cognitive faculty, or is, let's say, the variety of the cognitive faculty in question, right? That is suitable for investigation of the given domain, right? All right, so in the interest of time, I'm going to keep going, because I wanted to look at some of these passages that pertain to the questions of intelligent design and evolution. And Catherine might have some reasons for disputing some of what I say, which would be welcome, certainly. So in section 80, on the necessary subordination of the principle of mechanism to the teleological principle in the explanation of a thing as a natural end, Kant evokes here what the idea that, again, with Georges Cuvier, will soon Cuvier is still quite young at this particular moment, but that will soon come to be identified under the name of comparative anatomy. Cuvier, like Kant, is not an evolutionist in our sense, but he does, he has this famous principle, give me one vertebra, and I can reconstruct the entire skeleton. And from that skeleton, I can find this beast's proper position within the order of all vertebrates, right? So this is not hypothesizing phylogenetic kinship amongst the vertebrates. It's simply saying that all of the vertebrates, for whatever reason, have a kind of homology of form, such that, if two skeletons of two different species of vertebrate look really different from one another, then it would help you to find perhaps to find the intermediate species where the differences can be gradually accounted for by attention to the way certain features of the bones get elongated or shrunken or involuted or evoluted. And I'm going to talk about the significance of those terms in a moment. And of course, it's not Cuvier, but one of his contemporaries, oh, I'm forgetting the name, but for example, it's around this moment that people become very preoccupied, for example, with the fact that that whales have vestigial hip bones that fish do not have, and that these vestiges seem to indicate a structural homology with animals that walk on land on legs, and obviously to the early comparative anatomists, these structural homologies also impose on them the idea of the thought of kinship, even if for Kant and Cuvier alike, kinship is a no-go zone, right? It's a no-go zone, but they're thinking it anyway. All right, that said, I wanted to draw your attention to this term evolution, because it doesn't always, it doesn't always mean what we might think it means in Kant in a post-Darwinian context. I should have checked the German for this occurrence of evolution. Maybe someone else can do it quickly for us if they have the German at hand. But what Kant is talking about here is something like a literal unfolding. Maybe this is Entwicklung, which could also be translated as development. I'm not sure. But then if we go ahead a little bit, sorry, okay, so I've just jumped ahead considerably. And I think we are now in section 81. We have an occurrence of the term evolution that clearly doesn't jibe with what we mean by it in a post-Darwinian sense. The champions of the theory of evolution, Kant says, which accepts in every individual from the formative power of nature in order to allow it to come immediately from the hand of the creator, would still not have dared to have this happen in accordance with the hypothesis of occasionalism. And we haven't looked at what occasionalism is yet, but I just wanted to jump ahead to this occurrence of the term evolution to kind of show that Kant is using this term in a way that's already somewhat common in the 17th century. I can think, for example, of John Bulwer, but also will continue to be used by people like Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's grandfather, who wrote a pretty fascinating evolutionist poem circa 1800 called, I think, Zoonomia. So evolution along this line of thinking has nothing to do with natural selection or descent by a process of selection, but rather development upwards from lower to higher forms, right? In a way, Kant is implying here, in a way that is, as it were, predetermined or guided by the hand of the creator, right? So in a sense, the theory of evolution, as Kant is using it here, means what today we would think of as at least one of the variants of intelligent design theory. That is, the possibility, and this is something we see. I don't want to get too sidetracked on this, but we see, for example, in a lot of 20th century Catholic gestures or overtures towards accepting the theory of evolution in, for example, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who was himself a Catholic priest and a paleontologist, up through some of Pope John Paul's advisors. We saw this idea that evolution is real kind of development of higher, that is, let's say, metaphysically and theologically higher species from lower species, but in a way that, in effect, God rigged up from the start, right? And that's something more like what Kant is has in mind here by evolution. All right, but I wanted to go back a bit because there's a lot of discussion of theories of generation in their relationship to theories of cause. And this is, I think, an important connection, one that is, again, fleshed out from a number of different directions in this book that I edited now a long time ago, like 14 years ago. Catherine Wilson has a lovely article in there, the problem of animal generation in early modern philosophy. I think there's also an article by John Zamito, whom Catherine mentioned earlier. Anyhow, there's some good material in there, and one of the purposes was to show that talking about spermatozoa and embryos and so on in the context of early modern philosophy was not simply a narrow empirical matter, but rather, indeed, a lot seemed to hang on it for how we understand the relationship between divine causation and natural change in particular. And in this respect, debates about generation in philosophy from Descartes and William Harvey through Kant certainly take generation to be relevant to the most important questions of philosophy in the same way as for Aristotle. Nothing has changed in this relationship from Aristotle to Kant. It's crucial to work out the relationship because we need to know, as it were, where babies come from in order to really understand what the, let's say, the partition of tasks as between natural cause and divine cause is. So I was going to talk to you about this really interesting note on page 288. Well, let me just say a few words about this. Generatio equivoca, the first possibility is pretty close, as a pretty close synonym of spontaneous generation. That is, when there's generation of an organized being through the mechanism of crude unorganized matter, as when pond scum forms a bubble and it gets warm, and then the next thing you know, a frog emerges out of it, which of course does not actually happen, but was one of the competing theories for a long time. Kant contrasts this with generatio univoca, which is the generation of something organic by something organic. Then he also mentions generatio hominuma and generatio heteronuma. Heteronuma would presumably be the generation of one species by another species, or what in the kind of contemporary parlance today would be speciation, right? Now, speciation is nowhere to be found. This seems to be the kind of clearest statement in the third critique of Kant's rejection of evolution in our sense. All right. I think, let's see. I'm going to stop sharing my slides because I can't see anyone, and I don't even know how many people are still there. So given that we only have 9 more minutes, I wanted to say a few things about the passages on pre-established harmony and occasionalism. Kant is obviously rejecting both of these. Pre-established harmony, just very quickly, is a view that would naturally be associated with the name of Leibniz. It's the view that everything is, so to speak, rigged from the start to happen harmoniously, and that holds open the possibility for, let's say, God to not have to do the rigging at each moment, which is in turn the view that we usually call, and that Kant calls, occasionalism, which can be associated with a number of different names. Nicolas Malebranche is often evoked as a paradigm occasionalist. And there's a clear analogy, at least, to the range of possible theories of generation, which is the standard kind of view of at least human generation, that there is a sort of what's sometimes called empsychosis, or let's say, in what's a good term, Latin term for this, maybe induction of the soul by God at a particular moment in the course of embryonic development. That has an obvious kind of analogy to occasionalism, in the sense that it's God seeing to that most significant instance of cause in the world, the kind of cause that is generation, right? And this is, there's also an analogy that Kant toys with in these passages, without being too explicit about it, between pre-formation and pre-established harmony. So the that view would be then that there is no true new generation, but everything is kind of contained in the ancestors, and what looks like generation is really just, as Leibniz would put it, emergence upon the larger theater, or something like that. So let me see, are there any, does anyone want to break in at any moment? I did turn off my share, but there was one more, I did that prematurely, and there is one more slide that I wanted to show you. And this gets back to something we discussed with Catherine last week concerning the relationship to Blumenbach. This is in the same section in which Kant is talking about preformation versus epigenesis, and we find Kant explicitly rejecting Blumenbach's doctrine of the Bildungstrieb, the formative drive. He, that is Blumenbach, leaves natural mechanism an indeterminable, but at the same time also unmistakable role under this inscrutable principle of an original organization, on account of which he calls the faculty in this matter, in an organized body, in distinction from the merely mechanical formative power that is present in all matter, a formative drive, standing, as it were, under the guidance and direction of that former principle, right? So this then, and I'll stop sharing now that you've seen this, this then seems to contradict, and maybe Catherine or someone else can remind me of the exact language of that earlier passage that we identified that sounded Blumenbachian, and kind of allow that to stand as another example of possibly a point at which Kant is subverting something he's already claimed, or getting, as Catherine would say, confused about what it is he actually wants to say. The original passage that we're talking about is at 374. I'm not going to be able to pull that up today. I can just flag it. All right. Are there any comments or questions? Catherine? Your mic's on.
Yeah, I don't think I can find that passage either, but I did have some comments or questions about the very interesting passage you quoted about the homologies in the vertebrate skeleton. And this is really interesting because first he talks about that, and we don't have to look even after him because that's in Buffon. And it might even be in Maupertuis. Right. He knows those people. Yeah. And then he sort of segues into this very Epicurean theory of perishing. The less adapted creatures perish, and then nature sort of gets worn out and stops producing. And am I reading this right? That he's saying, yeah, that's all very well. It could well have happened like that. It's just that we still need teleology because it's still not enough to really understand what's going on. Yeah, yeah. He's actually quite sympathetic to both those daring adventures of reason.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly there's a lag time, I think, between the opening up of the possibility of acknowledging the extinction of species and the possibility of acknowledging speciation. And this is certainly clear in Cuvier, who is himself a paleontologist studying, you know, the sauropods that are being dug up in the vicinity of Paris. And you know, it was at least possible that some of those still existed somewhere else in the world, but it was perfectly easy to say, yeah, there used to be sauropods, there used to be woolly mammoths and things like that, and there aren't anymore. It was easy to say that before it was easy to say that that whales used to be cows or cow-like, and I certainly, I didn't mean to shift the conversation from Kant to Cuvier, but for Cuvier, there's nothing Epicurean about that acknowledgement. It's just, you know, an acknowledgement of what, you know.
Yeah, but he just jumps from one thing to the other. And then the footnote there about the aquatic animals developing into land animals, he gets that from Maillet. He gets that from Teleomed. It's
the Teleomed, the kind of, what is that, 1755 or so, the work on 1738. Yeah, you know it better than I do. The work on, in a sense, of, you know, the pioneering work on sedimentology and its implications for the chronology of the formation of the Earth, which was a very significant conceptual shift in the mid-18th century. My goodness, we're out of time and people are cutting out, so that went super fast, and I didn't get get nearly enough time to talk about epigenesis and preformation and all the stuff I wanted to talk about, let alone the final chapters, final sections of the appendix on methodology. So it's safe to say we're gonna have to let this stuff spill over into our final session. And I'm going to try to lasso some of our people who have been with us for some weeks and then kind of drifted away. I'm gonna force them to come back this one last time, and we'll have some kind of proper conclusion to this this whole thing. So anyhow, thank you so much for being here, and we'll see you next week. Thank you, Catherine, for all your input. Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks, Ognian, and everyone else who spoke up today. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.